As a truly final remark, I do believe that science is about providing a better understanding of ourselves and of the world around us. And such an intellectual achievement cannot be summarized by bibliometric indices like impact factors or age index. Nevertheless, for those interested in such matters, just consider that Humphrey had 8 first authored papers in Nature by the age of 30. So please say hello and congratulations to Professor Nicholas Humphrey.
The International Scientific Committee has awarded Nicholas Humphrey of the Mind and Brain Prize 12th edition. The prize will be delivered by our Dean, Gianmaria Iani.
This makes me feel like a boy of 10 years old again. And maybe that will help to excuse the speech I'm going to give, the lecture I'm going to give, which in some ways plays around with some very, not juvenile, but early and on the special ideas.
Prize has been awarded for the following reasons. So for his fundamental studies of the visual system, for his groundbreaking research on social intelligence, and for his theoretical and empirical investigation of subjective experience, which have provided a new approach to understanding the nature and function of consciousness, thereby forging links between psychology, philosophy, and evolutionary biology. Thank you.
Give me a moment while I change all these computers over.
I think we can close the ceremony, and I hope that there will be a next edition of the prize thanks to the generosity of the university and of all our sponsors, and of course of all of you. Thank you very much.
So there is no time to rest because you were invited to your talk as soon as you can. The life part is it?
Is it possible to lower the room lights a bit? I want the colours of my slides to appear as well as can be. Can we lower that? I'm balancing too many things here. Okay, let me say first, just in relation to this prize, when I opened the email from Bruno at the beginning of this year, I wasn't sure what the prize was going to be, or who had previously won it. And as I looked at the list of distinguished philosophers and scientists who had previously been awarded it, my eyes grew bigger and bigger. All I can say is that if I had to choose a group of clever, intellectual, funny, warm human beings to actually spend an evening or perhaps a week in isolation with, I couldn't choose a better group than the Mind and Brain Prize winners. So I just hope they'll welcome me to their company if we ever get to go. Okay, well, that's up already. I'm running a bit late, but I'm on Marco that I might actually, I hope will let me finish to the end of this talk, because it has a kind of punch at the end of it. I call it the invention of consciousness. Well, I needn't tell you here that consciousness is something that really matters to us, and many would say that it matters more than anything else in the world. We relish the heat and redness of a fire, the sour tang of a lemon, the caress of a lover's hand. Such conscious sensations lie at the very core of our being. Without them, we'd be poorer creatures living in a duller world. Yet, the fundamental nature of consciousness remains a scientific mystery. The problem isn't that we don't understand consciousness at all, it's that some aspects of it are some aspects of consciousness are relatively easy to explain. The problem is that one aspect continues to baffle everyone, and that's the qualitative feel of consciousness, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the qualia, or as Tom Nagel has put it simply, what it's like. Now, biologist Alan Orr probably speaks for the majority of scientists. When in a recent review of Tom Nagel's book, Mind and Cosmos, he writes, "I share Nagel's sense of mystery here. Brains and neurons obviously have everything to do with consciousness, but how such mere objects can give rise to the eerily different phenomenon of subjective experience seems utterly incomprehensible." Or, as philosopher Colin McGinn has colourfully put it, the brain is just the wrong kind of thing to give birth to consciousness. You might as well assert that numbers emerge from biscuits or ethics from rhubarb. Well, let's see. I've called my talk The Invention of Consciousness because I want to play on two different meanings of the word in English, at least I don't know how it is in Italian. An invention is defined as either a device or process developed by experiment designed to fulfill a practical goal. And alternatively, it can be a mental fabrication, especially a falsehood, designed to please or persuade. Now, I'm going to argue that consciousness is in fact an invention in both respects. To start with, consciousness is a cognitive faculty evolved by natural selection designed to help us make sense of ourselves and our surroundings. But, on top of that, consciousness is a fantasy conjured up by the brain designed to change the value we place on our own existence. And I'll explain that obviously in more detail as we go along. But first, in relation to those two, I'm going to argue that this phenomenal field, which it seems to be an inexplicable part of consciousness, has nothing to do with the first of those aspects of consciousness. It does have, however, everything to do with the second, with the value we place on being alive and being ourselves. But I want to begin with a very broad definition of consciousness. I don't think the first step need be that controversial, although many people think defining consciousness is a very tricky thing to do. At least I don't think it's difficult if we can ground the definition in the case we each know best subjectively, our own. If I may speak objectively on your behalf, consciousness is surely just what you are conscious of. That's to say, the various states of mind of which at any one time you are the subject and which are accessible to you by introspection. Now, it's true that consciousness so defined may be difficult to access in non-verbal animals, but fortunately, grown-up human beings can indeed tell us about it, at least up to a point. And what we all agree on is that you can be conscious of a range of rather different kinds of mental states: perceptions, memories, wishes, thoughts, feelings, and so on. When you introspect, you observe these various states, as it were, with an inner eye. And so it comes naturally to us, and people everywhere do this, to think of consciousness as some kind of theatrical stage, where the engine of the mind is on show. On show to whom? Well, to who else but you, yourself, the conscious subject. And this brings us immediately to one of the most striking features of consciousness. It's unity. There's only one you here, only one self, when you feel pain, or you want breakfast, or you remember your mother's face. It's the same you in every case. Now you may think it's obvious that it has to be so, but actually this unity is by no means a logical necessity. It's quite conceivable, and indeed psychologically plausible, that your brain could house several independent yous, subcells, you might call them, each representing a different module of the mind. And I believe, I've argued elsewhere, that this may in fact have been the way that you started out at birth. Back then, for the first few months of life, this might have been, that might have been the you that waggles your toe, this could have been the you that sees, this could have been the you that feels hunger. And at the start, these different yous hardly know each other. Fortunately, however, it was never going to stay that way. As your life got going and your body, your one body, began interacting with the outside world, these separate cells soon came into register, orchestrated, as it were, by the single line of music that made up your one life. So your subcells became merged into what you now experience as your one big self. Now, the binding of cells needn't have been pre-programmed, as some people think it would have had to be. I believe it could well have been the automatic outcome simply of the dynamics of mind and body. And let me show you the simplest possible of models of how this could work. Noise. Okay, 5 metronomes beating completely out of sync. Okay. But now, let's add a body to this. Oh, sorry, that's already gone that far. No. Okay, now they're out of sync. We put them onto rows so that they now interact as they move back and forth. And you see all beating in synchrony. They've come into synchrony because each individual metronome feels the pull of the others. I want to show just that last bit again because I think it's so astonishing. The spookiest effect here was first discovered by the 17th century Dutch scientist Christian Huygens. No, it's not here, sorry. But we saw, as they rested on that body, which moved with them, they all influence each other to come into harmony. And with consciousness, of course, the story has to be much more complex. Nonetheless, I don't think it need be very, very much more complex. I'd suggest that basically the unity of consciousness results simply from the fact that, just as with the metronomes, different modules of the mind feel the pull of the others. But then to the big question, what does this unity achieve? Once all the different kinds of mental state have the same subject, what follows? Well, to start with, it underwrites the most obvious function of consciousness, namely to create what Marvin Minsky has called the society of mind. Information from different modules is being brought to the same table, as it were, so that there can be fertile crosstalk between them. And you now have a mind-wide forum for planning and decision-making, at least in principle. The way is then open for the invention of a central processing unit to take control, an intelligent agent that can recognize patterns, marry past and future, assign priorities, and so on across the mind as a whole. As our central processing unit, IT people might call this agent an expert system, rather like an intelligent autopilot. You, of course, call the onboard pilot you. But now, alongside this, a further opportunity emerges. Once you have different mental modules interacting on a single stage, it becomes possible for an inner observer to monitor this interaction. And this new facet of your larger self, what I've called the inner eye, can actively examine and reflect on what's going on. And this capacity for self-reflection supports a second and very important function of consciousness, which Marco alluded to, namely to allow you to appreciate just how your mind works. Observing, for example, how beliefs and desires generate wishes that lead to actions, you find your mind revealed as having a clear psychological structure. So you begin to gain insight into why you think and why you act the way you do. This means you can explain yourself to yourself and explain yourself to other people too. But equally important, it means that you have a model for explaining other people to yourself. When you meet another person, you can assume that his mind works very much as yours does. So you can work out what he is likely to be thinking and how he will behave. Consciousness has laid the ground for what psychologists call theory of mind. Well, so far so good. We have a working definition of consciousness, and we've identified 2 ways in which it can be put to practical use. So that's 2 reasons why consciousness would have been likely to evolve. In fact, we even have a picture of how it might be working. Not exactly a working model, but a highly suggestive analogy, the theatre of consciousness. Now, don't get me wrong here. I'm well aware that Dan Dennett, our previous winner of the MNB Prize, he's poured scorn on the idea of what he calls a Cartesian theatre, a theatre where a duplicate of reality is on show to an inner observer. But that's not the kind of theatre I'm suggesting as an analogy. I want to suggest we make an analogy with a real human theatre. Real human theatres don't provide us with duplicates of reality. They provide us with a creatively transformed version of reality, something that invites us to understand things in a new way. And I'll argue that consciousness does that itself. It doesn't provide a duplicate. Some of you may have recognized that I've been using Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London as my example here. If you'll allow me a bit of a literary diversion, I'd actually like to borrow a bit more from Shakespeare. In a famous prologue to Henry V, Part 1, the chorus apologizes on behalf of the actors, mere ciphers or symbols he calls them, for daring to simulate the events of history on stage. Pardon, the chorus says, the flat, unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy scaffold to bring forth so great an object. How can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? But stay with me, the chorus says, for here's how it works. Just as a few zeros, suitably arranged, can represent a huge number, as he puts it, since a crooked figure, meaning a zero, may attest in little place a million. So the players on props on stage can represent to us, the audience, a reality of quite a different order. And so let us, ciphers, symbols to this great account on your imaginary forces work. I think this is a startlingly prescient metaphor, almost as if Shakespeare has anticipated modern ideas about the coding of representations in the brain. But actually, that's not where I want to take this quotation. No, I want to go to that teasing question which he asked, can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Now, cockpit, Shakespeare meant literally an arena for staging cockfights. He couldn't have known that the word cockpit would later come to mean the control room of a ship, and later still, the control room of an aeroplane. Yet now, when we're discussing consciousness, I'd say that the cockpit of an aeroplane actually provides an even better analogy than the theatrical stage does. And let's see where we can go with it. The plane's cockpit features a variety of independent instruments that display the output of subsystems that monitor a range of external and internal states of affairs. Here we can say the plane's beliefs, desires, and intentions are on display. In coded form, of course, speed, altitude, yaw, and so on are represented by symbols or numbers, by ciphers again. And here's where the pilot sits. See him, a privileged seat from which he is able to take in all the displays at once. His job is to integrate the different sources of information so as to decide what to do to achieve certain goals. He observes, and he thinks, then he acts, using the joystick to steer the intended course. And by the way, the pilot also has a cockpit radio, so he can report verbally to ground control. But you may be wondering, what's the point of this analogy? A conscious pilot as an analogy for a conscious agent in the brain? No, not at all. I want to use it as a further way of demystifying consciousness. Because the thing is, we all know, as a matter of fact, there's no need to have a living pilot in the cockpit to fly the plane. An electronic autopilot can, in fact, in many planes, does fulfill exactly the same function as the pilot. Autopilot integrates the information, chooses the best path, and so on. The autopilot can indeed even be designed to report of what it's doing to ground control and why, so even using simulated speech if required. And also, it can keep a record of what it's been up to that can be accessed by a third party later, even posthumously, if necessary. Now, true, no one has yet engineered a plane's autopilot to be capable of reading the minds of other planes, but as it happens, such metacognitive abilities are already being incorporated into computers in driverless cars, for example. To overtake safely, the computer must be able to anticipate how those other cars are likely to behave. The computer has, in effect, to have a theory of drivers. How does it learn that theory? Well, I don't know the facts here, but I wouldn't be surprised if engineers are already working on having autopilots learn about other autopilots by self-reflection. Perhaps Joe Lennon would know whether that's actually going ahead. But back to the question of consciousness. My point, of course, is that if an autopilot can be engineered to do all this, then it's not surprising that the brain can. We're talking normal science, normal engineering here. The science is, in fact, well underway. To mention a few areas of progress, which I'm sure you already know, Stander Hain, another prize winner, has been developing ideas, mapping, he's been mapping what he calls the global neuronal workspace. Giulio Tononi has developed a model of integrated information. Christoph Koch has identified a brain structure to Claustrum as a likely candidate for the Master of Ceremonies. Now, I suggested at the start that consciousness is an invention in the first sense of that term, a cognitive faculty evolved by natural selection designed to help us make sense of ourselves and our surroundings. Well, exactly. So far, it seems this is just what consciousness is. And as I suggested would be the case, we haven't had yet to say anything about the mysterious field of consciousness. You get your workspace, your integration, your theory of mind without it. But this is, of course, both good news and bad news. The good news is that we haven't yet had to deal with anything that looks scientifically outlandish. Bad news is that we're getting an account of consciousness that leaves out the very thing so many of us really want to understand. How about that eeriness of consciousness? How about the famous what it's like? Are we going to settle for consciousness without the beef? Well, we define consciousness at the outset as comprising all those mental states that are available to introspection. But now, if we are in fact going to make the eeriness of consciousness the issue, we'll have to focus in. Does that eerie quality in question pervade all conscious states that you can introspect? No, that's just it. This eeriness doesn't seem to be a feature of higher level cognitive states. At any rate, not a necessary feature. There's no special phenomenal field associated with your having the thought, say, that 2 + 2 is 4. It's not like anything for you to remember the date of your birthday, not like anything in legal sense. Rather, it seems the eeriness kicked in. Okay, that's my birthday. Okay, but the eeriness kicks in only at a more animal level. It's there especially, perhaps exclusively, in the way you represent what's happening at... Sorry. What's going on here? How do I quickly get through there? Sorry about that. Higher level states which don't have to feel like saying, okay, now what happens when we talk about the particular sort of mental state that represents what's happening at your bodily sense organs, skin, eyes, nose, ears, tongue, and so on. I'm talking about conscious sensations, which seem to me, phenomenally they are, a completely different case from the other cognitive states we talked about. We're talking about the pain of a bee sting, the salt taste of an anchovy, the blue look of the sky. Sensations, it seems, are intrinsically eerie. They couldn't be the states they are without having those mysterious properties that philosophers call qualia. The quality of pain, the quality of saltiness, the quality of blueness. And why should the science of consciousness be proceeding as if qualia don't exist? Well, partly it's because science can indeed go a long way towards explaining consciousness without having to mention qualia. But it's also because, to many people, the job of explaining qualia looks scientifically impossible. I quoted Alan Orr earlier as saying that qualia are utterly incomprehensible. Now here's Christoph Koch writing to me in an email recently. He wrote, "It's bizarre that brain matter should exude these phenomenal feelings. Consciousness is so vivid and its properties appear so otherworldly, but it seems to call for God." Well, Koch may have been half joking, but who's laughing? Short of invoking some supernatural agency, where are we to go? Well, there are indeed a good many scientists and philosophers too who simply don't want to go anywhere with it. It's not so much a case of qualia denial, though that exists too, as qualia avoidance. Isaac Newton set the tone for 500 years ago. He wrote, "But to determine more absolutely what light is, after what manner refracted, and by what modes of actions it produces in our minds the phantasms of colours, is not so easy, and I shall not mingle conjectures with certainties." By the phantasms of colours, he meant the subjective sensory states, and he said he wasn't going to go there. Jerry Fodor, another M&B Prize winner, he echoes Newton's pessimism, and he says, "We don't know, even to a first glimmer, how a brain or anything else that's physical could manage to be a locus of phenomenal experience. This is surely among the ultimate metaphysical mysteries. Don't bet on anybody ever solving it." Well, not everyone has been so ready to surrender. And as I'm sure you know, there has in fact been plenty of debate with some rather less than helpful suggestions about where to go. Still, I think it's fair to say that a consensus is emerging, at least about the boundaries of the problem. Many theorists, or most theorists, now accept that there are indeed only two options that can be taken seriously. We can be realists about qualia, or else we have to be illusionists. Well, the names, I think, make the meanings of these alternatives clear. Realists take qualia at face value. In their view, if your sensations appear to have qualities that lie beyond the scope of physics to account for, then it must be that they really do have such qualities. And this is possible because the brain activity that underlies sensations actually already has consciousness latent in it as an additional property of matter. A property as yet unrecognized by physics, but one that you, the conscious subject, are somehow able to tap into. For example, here's Tom Nagel in front of that. The existence of consciousness seems to imply that the physical description of the universe, in spite of its richness and explanatory power, is only part of the truth, and that the natural order is far less austere than it would be if physics and chemistry accounted for everything. So, according to the realists, here you are breaking through the veil of mundane physics to access the higher order realms of consciousness. Now, illusionists, by contrast, won't have any of this. They argue that if your sensations appear to have these marvelous non-physical properties, then this can only be because your physical brain is playing tricks on you. And this is possible because the brain is a computational engine that deals in symbols, as Shakespeare suggested. And physically based symbols can perfectly well represent states of affairs that do not and could not exist. So, as Dan Dennett making that point, consciousness is an illusion of the brain, for the brain, by the brain. Qualia are like a beautiful discussion of purple, just about a colour without itself being coloured. So, according to the illusionists, here you are accessing your brain, or your brain's own magic show, and being tricked into believing that you are in the presence of a higher dimensional world. In fact, yes, In fact, however, all that wondrous stuff is in fact coming from your side of the metaphysical divide. Okay, realism and illusionism. The trouble is that both these theoretical positions come at a considerable price. On the one side, the price of realism is that it implies that the standard physical description of the world is radically incomplete. Now, some people actually welcome this. Nagel, as we saw, thinks it would make the natural order less austere. But others, including me, I might say, find it a lazy and inelegant solution. Do we really need to dream of supraphysical realities? If we can send a probe on a journey lasting 10 years, crossing 4 billion miles of empty space, so as to land it on a comet speeding at 34,000 miles per hour, and actually get it there within 2 minutes of its planned arrival, doesn't that suggest that our existing physics is actually pretty much complete? If those other dimensions, which Nagel and others hope for, if they're there, they're certainly very coy. They're not showing up. But then on the other side, there's a price to illusionism too. Illusionism undermines and in many people's eyes devalues the mystery of human experience. Now, some welcome that too. Dennett clearly takes wicked delight in discomforting what he calls the mysterious. He's happy to be, as he puts it, the cock at Woodstock. But others find illusionism deeply depressing, complaining that it unweaves the rainbow, and so on. Well, which is right? I won't say we yet know for sure, but I know which I myself hope is right. However much fun it is to witness an apparent impossibility, I still want explanatory closure. Okay, so there's one illusion that can be made for default to fundamental, to reductionist explanation. Well, what about it? If there really is some trickery like this going on in the human brain, where's the explanation of it? Does anyone have any idea about what kind of physical processes might possibly lie behind illusionism, behind the generation of tricks by the brain? Well, as I'll explain in a moment, contrary to Fodor, I do think we have at least a first glimmer about it. But before going there, I suggest we consider a simpler example. When skeptics are questioning whether any scientific theory can deliver the magical effects, it will be good if we can point to a model mechanism that can emulate at least some of the functions that we're trying to explain. Then at least we'll have a proof of principle. So let's go back to my cockpit analogy. Now, imagine now that the plane has specialized sensors in its body, analogous to human sensor neurons, whose job is to represent what's happening at the body's surface: heat, pressure, tissue damage, and so on. And so correspondingly, there's a special set of sensory instruments in the cockpit which display this information. Now imagine now there's a fire in the wingtip of the plane. Message is sent through to the cockpit, just as a message is sent through to the brain of Descartes' boy. It registers on the instrument panel in front of the pilot. Fire, okay? But now imagine this. While all the other instruments on the panel, not the sensory ones, but all the others, use simple, flat, graphical or numerical visual displays like this, the sensory instruments, only the sensory instruments, dress them up in a very special way, as holograms. Now, we've all seen holograms. The picture appears to rise above the flat surface, and it's an illusion, of course. It only looks as if there's a third dimension, but our pilot doesn't know this. It seems to him the numbers really are jumping out of the screen. So, no wonder if he finds these sensory displays especially attention-grabbing and impressive. So, okay, that's what it looks like to him in his cockpit. They seem to fill the cockpit. He does his best to explain down the radio to the control tower what's happening, but he finds he hasn't got the words for it. He can't say what it's like. Words are failing him. Still, what matters most is that is that he experiences this firsthand. From now on, our pilot goes flying just for the joy of being there. As Lord Byron said, the great object of life is sensation, or in his pilot's case, to go up there and bathe himself in these holograms. I'll continue the Byron quote. The great object of life is sensation, to feel that we exist, even though in pain. But I mustn't get carried away just because Byron does and our pilots do. I'm running ahead of my own argument. Okay, an analogy is an analogy. A hologram is a hologram. What can this possibly have to do with brain and qualia? Well, dare I say it, maybe it's not just an analogy. I draw your attention to the so-called holographic principle, which has arisen from consideration of what happens to information apparently lost in black holes. It's the holographic principle. Just as a 2D surface can contain all the information required to construct a 3D world, so an n-dimensional surface can contain all the information required to construct an n+1 world. The 2D surface of a black hole, for example, can therefore preserve the information about all the 3D objects that have disappeared into it. And by the same token, the 3D world we think we live in could actually be a holographic illusion from a flat surface. But more to the point, the 4D world, four-dimensional world of conscious qualia could in fact quite well be an illusion from the surface of a three-dimensional brain. Someone said about the holographic principle in relation to black holes, it was, he said, this idea is so odd, it's incomparable to finding that the instruction manual for a dishwasher holds the recipe to making a good chocolate souffle. Okay, I liked it when I came across that. As Colin McGinn, as you remember, saying about consciousness, you might as well assert that numbers emerge from biscuits or ethics from rhubarb. I really think it looks as if we might be onto something here. Yeah, but how exactly could this work? As it happens, Carl Pribram in the 1970s did actually raise the possibility that information in the brain is stored in holograms, but no one today takes Pribram's detailed model seriously. So how else might the brain be generating a magical, higher order dimensional display? Well, I've been working on an answer to this question for many years now. I've been looking for an answer that takes account of evolutionary history. And this isn't the time, of course, to give you the full story, but I can at least try to give you a brief overview. The brain I've shown here may look like a modern human brain. It does look like a modern human brain. But I want you to imagine it's actually the brain of a very ancient and relatively primitive creature. This creature has sense organs at its body surface, and when these sense organs are stimulated, they send information centrally to the brain. And the brain responds reflexively with an evaluative response, bringing onto the motor areas to do something about the stimulus. Now, this reflex response has been precisely tailored by evolution so as to be appropriate to the particular stimulus. What kind of stimulus it is, where on the body the stimulation is occurring, what import it has for the creature's well-being, and so on. This was back in the days of very, very primitive organisms. So, from the start, the response can be said to be meaningful, which is to say that the response potentially carries a lot of interesting information about what the stimulation means for the animal, for the creature, at least potentially. However, to begin with, there's no one at home in the brain to realize this potential, no one to take an interest in that meaning. But evolution is inventive. Before long, there arises in the brain a special module, proto-self we can call it, whose job is exactly that, to form a mental representation of what the stimulation is about. And as luck would have it, it turns out it can do this by the simple trick of reading, extracting the meaning from the motor command signals that are being sent out to produce the reflex response. So here we have for the first time the subject of this representation. And in truth, we can say he is the first subject of sensation. But let's note there's nothing fancy or magical about sensation at this stage. But I'm going to come to that. Back at the start, these reflex sensory responses were overt bodily actions. I've already made into a loop, which I didn't mean to. They were overt bodily actions occurring at the site of stimulation of the body's surface. We call them wiggles of acceptance or rejection. However, things were not going to stay like that. As the descendants of the original creatures evolved to be more sophisticated, these overt responses soon enough became inappropriate, even inconvenient. So another creature faced a problem. There's a creature making a real response, which in the past was really useful to it, and it could be observed by this image observer. But now it's beginning to get in the way. It's not suitable for these grown-up creatures, which have evolved to be much more sophisticated. So another creature faced a problem: how to lose the bodily behavior but keep the information about the meaning of the stimulus. And the solution, natural selection, was ingenious. It was for the responses to become internalized or privatized. That's what I meant to bring that in. Such that the motor signals no longer reach the actual body surface, but rather they begin to target the body map where the sense organs first project to the brain. Now, this privatization has a fortuitous result. It means that a feedback loop was created between motor and sensory regions, a loop that had the capacity, of course, to sustain recursive activity, going round and round, catching its own tail. And so we're getting an interesting sort of recurrent and long-lasting result from simulation comes in. And feedback loops, such as this, as many of you, I'm sure, know, have remarkable mathematical properties. Suppose that each time the activity circles around the circuit, the transmission characteristics, the way the signal is passed from one to the other, one side to the other divide, supposing they're altered by the activity the previous time around, then the development will be described by a delay differential equation. And typically this means that the activity will either develop chaotically or else will settle into a so-called attractor state, in which the same pattern repeats itself differently. Okay, here's a film clip showing an example of such a developing pattern, just generated by some feedback. In this case, it's a relatively simple attractor that exists in 3 dimensions, and here's another still more pretty one. But the thing is that these attractors can turn out to be very much more complicated, so that they do indeed occupy a higher dimensional landscape, and the number of additional dimensions can be very large indeed. So could this be where the holographic principle comes into play? Well, I won't pretend I understand the detailed mathematics, but I'm confident in saying that if we want a basis for higher dimensional representations in the brain, surely here we've got it. Here is a nice low-level example. I'll just show you to whet your appetite. A rotating 4-dimensional object, a tesseract, seen as it intersects 3D space. But that's, of course, just a taster. In the course of evolution, natural selection had plenty of opportunity to tinker with the structural details of the feedback loops so as to vary the resulting attractors and the way they would appear for the subject. Now today, hundreds of thousands of years later, we experience every day the magical phenomena that nature selected. Every time we look at the blue sky, every time we smell a rose. It's thanks to these internal recursive loops. Well, so there we've got it. I put forward this account of sensations more than 20 years ago. My arguments were largely theoretical rather than empirical, but I'm happy to say it looks as if at least one prediction has recently got experimental backing. There's tantalizing evidence that conscious experience in humans does indeed involve the monitoring of activity in a loop running between primary and sensory cortex and areas further forward. For example, a recent beautiful experiment by Victor Lamy, he showed that if we stimulate, I don't think my pointer working, if we simulate in V5 down there, yes, you can see it, with TMS, we elicit a conscious visual sensation. But if we follow that with a second stimulus, a tenth of a second later to V1, then no experience occurs at all. The loop has been interrupted and we don't get any phenomenology. Standerheim, other winner, Nobel M&B winner, interestingly, something of a Qualia denier himself, he wrote in his last book, "Consciousness lives in loops, reverberating neuronal activity, circulating in the web of our cortical connections, causing our conscious experience." So, okay, there we are. You don't have to buy into the details of this theory, but I hope you'll agree that at least it's better than no theory at all. And actually, it has other empirical support that I'd describe if I had time. But I'm nearing the end of my talk for a few more minutes. And I want to give some time to the other big question I've left hanging. It's the question about the evolutionary function of qualia. No matter what the actual mechanism, why did this remarkable feature of consciousness evolve? What can have been the biological advantage of dressing up sensations in this provocatively mysterious way? Well, let me return to my definition there. The cognitive faculty evolved by natural selection, designed to help us make sense of ourselves and our surroundings. But as we've seen, this does work very well for the aspects of consciousness we discussed in the first half. But now, when it comes to qualia, this notion of invention simply isn't going to fit at all. At first sight, at least, qualia are neither cognitive nor helpful. Fodor states the difficulty in his typically blunt way. Consciousness seems to be among the chronically unemployed. Trey's talking about qualia. As far as anybody knows, anything our conscious minds can do, they could do just as well if they weren't conscious. Why then did God bother to make consciousness? John Searle, another group who's been honoured here, he makes much the same point about qualia having no impact at the level of behaviour. As far as the ontology of consciousness is concerned, behaviour is simply irrelevant. We could have identical behaviour in two different systems, one of which is conscious and the other totally unconscious. Well, if these philosophers are right, it's clear there's no way qualia can be affecting biological survival. If behaviour would be identical without them, then natural selection can never get a grip of it, which means that they can't evolve in a typical Darwinian way. And we don't know any other way for design to be put in place in nature. But are these philosophers right? I think the plain answer is no, they're not. They're guilty of massive failures of imagination. Fodor says qualia are unemployed. He seems to take it for granted that if consciousness does have a job to do, this can only be to provide us with some special kind of skill, helping us to act more intelligently or more efficiently in the service of some practical goal. But what if this behaviourist notion of employment is simply not appropriate when discussing qualia consciousness? What if consciousness, rather than making us more intelligent or more productive on the outside, makes us somehow bigger on the inside, emotionally and spiritually bigger? What if consciousness is actually an invention in that second sense I mentioned, a fantasy conjured up by the brain, designed to change the value we place on our being? Well, think about it. Think about the real impossible triangle. For what purpose did Richard Gregory invent this brilliant illusion? Well, it surely wasn't to serve any practical purpose. Look at Richard's broad smile. He did it simply to amaze us. And could nature have done the same when she invented qualia? Did nature do it so that conscious creatures would amaze themselves? Well, don't get me wrong, I am a card-carrying Darwinian reductionist. I have no wish to get off the explanatory hook by substituting fuzzy answers rather than clear ones. But still, I do think that there are times when, in the interests of science, we scientists need to loosen up. Before we pronounce on the employability of phenomenal consciousness, we need to undertake a proper natural history. We should be studying how conscious experience actually changes the way people live in the world. How does exposure to qualia change people's psychology? What beliefs and attitudes are generated? How does it affect people's ideas about who and what they are and about what kind of world they live in? I think these ought to be empirical questions to be asked of ordinary people, and we should be ready to consider all sorts of possible answers, not just those we'd find discussed in the science or philosophy sections of the library, but perhaps those that belong in the self-help section in the new age, even some ideas which at first sight might seem a bit flaky. And most important, we should begin the inquiry close to home by taking seriously our own intuitions about just how and why consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, matters to ourselves. Think about it. Suppose that magic for you were not there. Suppose your sensations were in fact just brown bag numbers, like for a pilot in a conventional cockpit. Numbers that haven't come to life as holograms. What would you be missing from your life? Well, it's clear to me that in the semi-zombie state, you would in fact lose out on several levels, if this is what you want. The levels I'll show you are in fact rather grand ones. First, you would lose your psychological essence, your core self. Next, you'd lose your sense of involvement with things in the outside world. And then finally, you'd lose your soul, and other human beings would lose their souls too. I'll explain, but I see I have to make this brief. Let's go back to my picture of that monkish philosopher engaging with the brain. Earlier in this talk, I described how the core human self originates as the singular subject of a range of mental states. But now let me say it, even when all those sub-selves are gathered together, that larger self is by no means secure. A self stripped of sensations would remain a pretty anemic kind of self. But add in the qualia, and everything changes. By lifting sensory experience into that mysterious non-physical plane, qualia deepen and enrich your sense of your own presence. You find yourself living in what I've called thick time. So you become the owner of a self that you can't but consider worth having, a self you want to expand and preserve for its own sake. Take away this primary sense of being there, and your existence would simply be well less founded, less convincing to you and to everyone else. And then we can move to a world. Although it's not perhaps quite so obvious, I want to say that if you didn't have phenomenal consciousness, you would lose the outside world, at least the world you've come to know and love. Even though it's your brain that creates the qualia, you can't but project the special qualities of sensations out onto the objects of perception in the outside world. And so, in doing so, you spread a kind of fairy dust around you. You yourself enchant that world. Take away this magic paintbrush, and the external world would lose much of its significance. You'd find yourself living in a less awesome place, less fun, less promising. And then we come to soul. Now, you created all this beauty around you. The things out there, experienced through bodily sensation, are singing your song. But you can't but realize that when you pay homage to the beauty of nature, you're really paying homage to yourself. And so, by a strange inversion, the magical world you've made returns the compliment and further enhances your sense of your own significance. Then add in the poetry of human culture, and by one path or another, your core self becomes elaborated into that marvelous cultural construct, the human soul. A soul that, with your generous theory of mind, which we talked about, a soul you then find and project on other people too. Well, I said we shouldn't be shy of embracing poetic interpretations, and no one has expressed better how the human soul takes flight on the wings of bodily sensation than the 17th century poet and mystic Thomas Traherne. As you'll see, he's actually a dead ringer for that monk in the engraving. First, Traherne asks you to consider, to recognize your own role as the artist behind the qualia-soaked world. By the very right of your senses, he writes, you enjoy the world. Doth not the glory of the sun pay tribute to your sight? But then he explains what you can and must make of this. You never enjoy the world aright, till the sea itself floweth in your veins, till you're clothed with the heavens and crowned with the stars, and perceive yourself to be the sole heir of the whole world. But rather than allowing this to end in individual self-congratulation, he insists that what's true of you must believe to be true of other people. Goes on. And more than so, you are the sole heir of the whole world, and more than so, because men are in it who are everyone sole heirs as well as you. It's wonderful kind of Zen-like notion, isn't it? Everybody is the soul add to the world. Okay, Traherne, as you may imagine, was far from being a humble servant of God shown in that Victorian stained glass window of Hereford Cathedral. This new portrait, I like to think, captures, comes nearer to the truth. I think it captures Traherne's boundless enthusiasm for living on this earth in the company of other souls, living on an earth and in a company for which we each bear personal responsibility. But it all begins with qualia. Take away qualia consciousness and this remarkable source of spiritual connection, and human society would begin to fall apart. But here, let me show you a brief bit of film which will make the point about other people better than I can with words or slides.
Well, there's an unexpected answer, but it's the answer that as a scientist I'd put my money on. If we want to learn how these remarkable experiences contribute to biological survival, we need to look at the lives of conscious creatures in their natural environment. And for humans, that means especially the world of other people. When we survey the social scene, I think the evidence is clear. The chief benefit of being conscious lies in the way it changes people's psychological profile. Consciousness feeds our self-worth, our joy in life, our fear of death, and especially it increases our respect for the other conscious beings we live alongside. By placing each one of us at the center of a mystery, consciousness encourages us to think of ourselves and others as spiritual beings, and of the world about us as an enchanted place. The philosopher Descartes famously said, "I think, therefore I am." But the consciousness that has evolved around the magic of sensations is deeper and more generous than this. I feel, therefore I am. Therefore you feel, and you are too.
Okay, so I'm going to end there except on two more sentences. When I quoted Shakespeare's prologue to Henry V, I omitted the first lines. Here's how they read. Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. Well, the chorus clearly means invention in the second sense. I used it. He's seeking permission for the actors to create an extraordinary work of fiction. Well, as I hope I've shown, nature did it first. Qualia are just such an invention. Arguably the brightest heaven, the most remarkable story that anyone has ever dared to tell. Thanks to natural selection, we all contain within ourselves that muse of fire. Thanks.
I think we have time for one question or two very short question and answer. No question?
No, Frederic has.
I have a question, but I'm happy to give it to someone else.
It's yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. The question arises in the following way about the characterization of our full-blown life, which is obviously evolving consciousness, whether consciousness actually has a function to enable us that, or whether we benefit after evolution brought phenomenal experience into place, then all the other things, like having a very rich social life and all the other things, developed in the way you illustrated with the film at the end. So maybe the phenomenal experience, the functional role in evolution is a bit much more basic. It comes in with emotions, it comes with pain, it comes with very basic needs to keep a body integrity and to keep evolutionary basic needs. If that's a true perspective, then consciousness is having a functional role, and the other things are just later beneficiaries after it's invented.
Well, I understand what you're saying and see why you say it, but I think, certainly sensation has played that role very far back in history. But nature of sensation has changed, and it may have been not relatively recently. I don't think we're talking about alligators or birds or having sensations with the qualia field that ours do. I think that came in later. So true sensations are very important, whether they're sensations of pain or anything else to do with the body, in establishing, yes, the limits and range of our body which we're going to protect, as Frederica probably explained. But they don't have to have that magical quality. I use that so often. They don't have to be out of this world in that sense, and generating this kind of puzzle about what metaphysical universe we inhabit. That's what I've emphasized here, and I think that was a relatively late comer. I won't say that human beings are the first to experience qualia as we experience them, but I think human beings are the first to experience them as we experience them. I think that natural selection has adjusted them in all sorts of subtle ways in order to make us ask new questions, to make us not only believe in the self, but believe in a possible afterlife, and a whole lot of other factors which come in and make us have the kind of sense of our own significance and the sense of our own beauty that we do. Of course, it's a continuum. It must be if we're Darwinians. And I've, in my book, Soul Dust, I think you quoted it there, I begin low down and ask about the role just in generating a core self of sensations, but then raise it to the level at which we need to deal with something of a very different order, which I've labelled here, the human soul.
Frederic, we certainly grant you one more question.
Thanks for this lovely talk. I was just wondering why you keep talking about qualia in terms of illusions. Because so you made the point about illusion and reality seems to imply some kind of dualism that you didn't want. I fully agree with you on that. But reality of qualia does not mean that it has to be something extra physical. It could be real as water in your glass, but still it can be reduced or it can supervene on low-level properties. So the fact that we can explain it by lower properties such as, for instance, these loops that you described does not make it an illusion. So do you have an extra incentive to call it an illusion?
Well, I want to distinguish it from being real in the sense which Nagel and Searle and others insist that it must be. I think consciousness has dimensions which appear to us not to be part of the natural world. That we begin to think of ourselves as occupying some higher level of space, which is not the space which would be occupied by computers or stones or natural phenomena. That's, I think, very important to us. And the analogy I give of that three-dimensional triangle is quite clear there. What the difference between an illusion and reality is. We have the information is coming from a real object, and we represent it as having a structure which it couldn't have in the physical world. I think for many reasons to say, particularly in relation to the temporal qualities of consciousness, that consciousness and conscious qualia have something which we simply couldn't model in terms of conventional physics. Like, for example, what I've called the thick moment, the fact that the individual moment of consciousness is stretched, so that while time moves on in a continuous stream, we don't experience it as moving on instant by instant. We experience it as coming with a succession, overlapping succession of longer, deeper temporal moments. Now, you wouldn't be able to model that. That must be an illusion. And in fact, I've given some ways in which we make that illusion work. You quoted Craig yesterday. He, of course, likes it, so he's gone the same way with some of the ideas about qualia and time. But there's much more to talk about later.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you all, and thank to the organizer. Now there is a lunch break which is offered next room, and we start again at 2, I think, right? Is that correct? Is that well, you have all the programs, you know that better than me, but now there's offer lunch.